Ready? Good morning, everybody. Happy Advent. Kind of. We're almost there. We're almost to Advent. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We are back for a few weeks before we take our Christmas holiday. A reminder that we've got our schedules on the bookmarks. And so if you don't have a bookmark, you can grab one on your way out at the doors. You can catch it on our website, stmichael.org/rbs. And then, of course, Bub sends emails each week. And so if you get those emails, you will have the schedule. If you don't, then make sure you see her or sign up on the way out. Or if you're watching online, you can comment below, and she will make sure that you are added to that list. We've got a few weeks, and then we take a few weeks off for Christmas. So a couple weeks ago, we were focused on chapter 6, and we didn't quite finish chapter 6. The very end of that chapter talks about Jesus' followers kind of dividing and some of them leaving him. So we're going to clean that up today before we jump into chapter 7. A reminder that we've got our podcast coming up, and so if you listen online, you're welcome to do that and go back and listen to old episodes. And then, of course, I love questions, so bring them. We didn't get any questions last week, as if you all were doing something else. And so if you've got those questions, share them today and we'll get to them. Let's start with a prayer. I'll catch you. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks. Thanks for the gift of this life, and thanks for the opportunity for us to be with those we love. We ask you to open our hearts and minds today, that as we study your word, we can be enlightened and inspired. Be with all those that we hold in the silence of our hearts, especially those who need your healing touch today. Be with those around the world who are seeking after peace and justice, and may we, in our small ways, help move that needle so that your love is realized here and everywhere. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, I saw one hand.
Yes, before we get started, everyone, I'm sure, is anxious to hear about your trip to New York.
Oh, haha. The question's about being in New York. So if you did not see our ridiculous picture of being in the Macy's parade, I will share that with you afterwards. But it was wonderful. I will say that at the very end, because we walked with Santa, of course, the broadcast wants to show Santa, who is 2 stories above the street. So we really were not on the TV. Thank you for those of you who looked. We had a few people who sent me screenshots where we were there either at the very beginning when Santa comes out or over the credits. You could see us, which was really not the point. But I will tell you, walking with Santa in the parade meant that every person screamed their head off when we came down the street, or they had their phones out. It was the most fun. So for an extrovert, I was like supercharged at the end of the parade. I was like, what are we doing next? You know? So it was amazing. It was amazing. So thank you. And everything was safe. It was great. The weather was beautiful. I hope you all had a nice Thanksgiving too. Okay. Any questions about chapter 6 or things that you may have been thinking of over the last couple weeks? If not, we'll just kind of tie up chapter 6. Okay, so at the end of chapter 6, Jesus has been doing some hard teachings, and this was kind of inevitable. But as Jesus is doing miracles, people are really excited. They want more of what he's offering because they're human. And when they see people who cannot walk now can walk, people who are healed, they're really attracted to what Jesus is doing. But like I said, the inevitable happens where Jesus' teachings become just hard. And I think we all understand that. Jesus can feel at first, kind of in that first step or that shallowest moment, Jesus can feel quite nice. You know, love, sure, love feels great. And all of that can feel kind of like a warm hug until something bad happens, or until Jesus kind of shakes us out of whatever sort of unintentional way of living we might have. And then we feel challenged. Some of us will receive that challenge as an opportunity to reevaluate our priorities, our values, the way we make choices. But then other people don't wish to be challenged, And so they will simply reject the challenge as if that is somehow unbiblical or unfaithful. And so the people right around Jesus at the end of chapter 6 are kind of having that same experience where some of them are drawing in to Jesus, they're leaning in, whereas others are feeling that challenge and they don't really want to be challenged. They just kind of want to be entertained. They want to see miracles. They don't really want to have to think differently or live differently or leave the things that they like behind. And so at the end of chapter 6, what we see is a division among the people who had been following Jesus. And this is particularly important in the development of the 12, because essentially what we see is that all the people who were being entertained, they were being fed, they were watching miracles, they were hearing some interesting ideas, but when they really felt the challenge, they kind of went, I don't really need all that, and so they left. The 12 there remain. And we have this really lovely moment where Jesus turns to the 12 and says, "Are you going to stick with me?" And the 12 essentially respond, "Where else can we go?" And it is not hopeless. What these 12 have really begun to understand is that what Jesus represents is everything. And what the world represents has no value in real terms, that the truth of God is really manifest right here in this one person. And even if it's hard, it's still true. And so they may not quite understand what the truth is. They certainly will never quite get all of it. And we see that all the way through the Passion, where they continue to make mistakes and they continue to misunderstand, but they stay. And that's really important. And so for us, we can get lost in a lot of theological differentiation. And we can even begin to argue amongst ourselves about the right way to do certain things. The best of being a follower, the best of being a disciple, is that you just stay. It makes me think of things like, we just had Thanksgiving holiday, and Thanksgiving is one of those moments where a lot of people get to be around their family. And for some people, that is so nice. I know, some of you almost spit when you laugh. For some people, that really is quite nice. I mean, it's lovely. And for others, it's this kind of like deep breath, steel yourself, because you've got to be around the people that you are related to that you may try to avoid most of the time. Or even better, the people you're related to who bring people that you don't necessarily want to be around. So however that fits, Thanksgiving is one of those moments where you show up and you eat around one table. Unless you're a very big family, you might eat around multiple tables. But the idea, the metaphor of you get together and you eat around one table is really important, because whether or not you like each other or you agree with each other, which certainly is never going to happen around most Thanksgiving tables, you show up because you're family. And in that very deepest level, you don't have to actually agree. That's not the point. That's not the highest priority. The highest priority is that you really show up for each other. And that's one of the reasons I really like the Episcopal Church. We often joke about how Episcopalians don't necessarily have strict beliefs about one thing or another. If you look at, say, a Roman Catholic catechism, you could kill somebody with it because it's really big. You look at the Episcopal Catechism, which is like 18 pages in the back of our prayer book, and who is God? God is Father, Son, and Spirit. The end. There really isn't, our catechism's really, really simple. And it's not simple because we don't wish to say more about it. It's simple because we've tried really hard to reduce who we are and what we believe to as basic and as core as possible. Because it's really not the point that we refine and refine and refine super specifically. The point is that we keep showing up together. And even in our disagreements and in our differences, we represent God's wholeness. All people are made in God's image, especially the people you don't like. The creation, the incarnation, is a very inconvenient truth because it's easy to like the people who are likable. It's much harder to like the people who are unlikable. And by unlikable, that's totally your perception. It's not like an actual truth for most. So there are that challenge of being together because we are all made in God's image is something that we all have to live with quite deeply because there are most people are not like us. Most people are not like you. And I say us, I don't mean anything like that. I just mean, if you think about it, each of us are individual. Almost everyone else in the world is different. All of those people are made in God's image. And when we are all together, we represent more closely God's wholeness. And so what's happening right here at the end of chapter 6 is you're beginning to see some splintering and differentiation. Jesus is no longer just cool. Jesus is now challenging. And people will begin to struggle with the challenge. And we, of course, know that as you go down that road of challenge, you get to the cross. And so as people are challenged more and more, the political will, so to speak, in the community grows to the point where Jesus will ultimately be arrested and tried and crucified because enough people have lost kind of the entertainment value of Jesus and have not quite accepted the deep truth and the challenge that he provides. So that kind of closes us up with chapter 6. Any questions about that? Chapter 7 is a lot of stuff, and we will jump in. Questions? All right, so let's do chapter 7. We've got 3 sections today of chapter 7. The first, we're going to talk about the Festival of Booths, kind of what that is and how that whole thing begins. Then we're going to talk about the identity of the Messiah. And third, we're going to speak of living water. And so let's jump in with the Festival of Booths. Let's start with, what is this festival? If you are familiar with the Festival of Tabernacles or Sukkot, this is all the same thing. Essentially, what this moment is it's kind of an agricultural festival. If you think about giving thanks for rain that waters the plants and the harvest and all that stuff, it's kind of a harvest festival sort of thing. But it directly relates back to when the Israelites were taken out of Egypt and they wandered the wilderness and God provided for them. So in the same way Jesus was talking about bread and manna from heaven in chapter 6, we get chapter 7 connected to this big festival where people would literally leave their homes and they would create little dwellings. I hate to call them tents because we think of tents, we have a particular image, but essentially it's like you would kind of just go sleep outside for a week. And so people would go outside, they would raise up sometimes super simple dwellings, sometimes very big, elaborate dwellings with tables and where whole families would eat together. But the point was, you leave your home and you go outside and you're exposed to the elements in order to remind you, as Jewish people, that God provides everything you need. That's really the idea. So the Israelites went off into the wilderness. They began to shift toward Judaism, and while they were in the wilderness, God provided. And so now every year in the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles or Sukkot, whichever word you want to use, Jewish people would leave their homes, live outside for a week, to remind themselves that God provides everything they need. So the point really is that you reset your life in some way to say all the things that might occupy my mind, that might worry me, that might make me feel like I don't have what I need, I am very tangibly reminded that God provides everything I need. It's a really beautiful idea. It isn't lived out, perhaps, as poetically beautiful or as theologically beautiful as it might sound. It ended up being something people did, and it kind of ended up being like a tailgate. So I know that it's not a perfect metaphor, but if you think about when we go out and we do things like we eat outside, or nobody is like scraping, like finding berries in the bushes. I mean, that's not what we're doing. We're taking, it reminded me of like, we love to go to the grocery store and buy meat and cheese and crackers and bread and stuff like that and go have like a picnic in the park. Think of it that way. These people are not suffering during the Feast of Booths. That's not what this is. And so Jesus comes into this festival as a challenging presence to the kind of party atmosphere that really marks this particular festival. But we're going to start at the very beginning of chapter 7, where there's a little bit of kind of teasing. There's sort of like a will he or won't he go to the festival. Jesus had been in Jerusalem. He had not had a great experience. Remember the last time Jesus was in Jerusalem, he had healed the paralyzed man, the crippled man, by the pool, and everybody freaked out. Jesus left. He has now been up in Galilee. So geographically speaking, he is up in the north in Galilee. His brothers want him to go back to the festival, which is in Jerusalem, because he's gained some notoriety and some attention, and they want him to go do his thing. And Jesus kind of resists it here in the beginning. Let's look at the opening of chapter 7. After this, which was chapter 6, Jesus went about in Galilee. He did not wish to go about in Judea because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. Now the Jewish festival of booths was near, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify against it that its works are evil. Go to the festival yourselves. I am not going to this festival, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. So essentially what's happening here is Jesus has gone up to Galilee, he's been walking around, he's been doing some stuff, and his brothers say, "Take your show on the road and go back to Jerusalem." That's where everyone is. Jerusalem is really where God is present. Now remember, the temple in Jerusalem is where God is physically present on earth. So we have to set aside the way that we understand God's presence and really be right there in the first century with this Jewish idea of God is not present in our hearts, God is present in the temple. And so everybody goes to Jerusalem for the festival of booths. Jesus' brothers want Jesus to go there because that's where everybody is. And they want everybody to see Jesus doing all of these amazing things. And it's interesting that John notes here, for not even his brothers believed in him. What he's really trying to do is draw a distinction between people who like to see the Jesus show and people who actually understand what Jesus represents. And so not even Jesus' brothers understood yet what Jesus actually represented. They were focused on the amazing acts that Jesus could perform and how much attention it got Jesus. Quick side note, when we say Jesus' brothers, these are not like brothers in Christ. That's not what we're talking about. These are Jesus' actual brothers. And so if that offends your sensibility because you need Mary to have been a perpetual virgin after Jesus' birth, then don't even worry about it. You can just ignore it and Mary can go on being a virgin forever. A good Jewish woman would have had more children. And so here we have John speak of Jesus' brothers. Sure, Jesus had brothers because Mary was a good Jewish woman. She kept having kids. That's enough. So there you go. If you really need to ask a question about that, that's fine. But I'm good with you liking that or not liking that. It's not necessarily going to change whether you go to heaven. Okay, so at this point, Jesus says, "I'm not going, you go. I'm going to stay in Galilee." But let's continue on with verse 10. "But after his brothers had gone to the festival, then he also went." He didn't want to be left out. "Not publicly, but as it were, in secret. The Jews were looking for him at the festival and saying, 'Where is he?' And there was considerable complaining about him among the crowds. While some were saying, 'He's a good man,' others were saying, 'No, he's deceiving the crowds.' Yet no one would speak openly about him for fear of the Jews. About the middle of the festival, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were astonished at it, saying, "How does this man have such learning when he has never been taught?" Then Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Anyone who resolves to do the will of God will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own. Those who speak on their own seek their own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and there is nothing false in him." So we'll pause there. So I love this. Verse 9 says, after saying all of this, he remained in Galilee. And then verse 10 says, but after his brothers had gone to the festival, he decided he was going to go too. So I can just imagine, I love the little moments where Jesus seems quite human. So he's staying in Galilee. You all go to the festival without me. Then you can imagine Jesus is like kind of, he's at home and he's sort of staring at the walls. And he's thinking, everybody's having fun in Jerusalem without me. Maybe I'll go, but I'll go in secret. And so he pulls over the hoodie and he kind of tries to sneak down to Jerusalem to the festival. So it's like a Disney movie. He tries to put on he puts on a costume so that no one will notice him. But then we get what I love about the middle of the festival. Jesus went up to the temple and began to teach. So it's like he cannot resist. So no, I'm going to stay in Galilee, and that lasts a day. And then he puts on a little costume and he sneaks down so that no one knows he's there, and that only lasts a couple days because by the middle of the festival, he just cannot resist going to the temple and starting to teach. So he's trying, I suppose, not to draw attention to himself right now, but he is failing miserably. And so he essentially goes right up to the temple. And I don't know if we've talked about this, the idea of the physicality of the temple this year yet. I do remember we did this last year when we talked about David and Solomon, but the temple is like concentric rings that all focus on the center, which is the Holy of Holies. Those rings include porches. It's essentially just covered areas. And when you think of a porch, this is a big space. This is not like the porch at your house. This is the space where crowds of 10, 20, 30 people could gather under the porch. And teachers would gather their disciples to teach under the porches of the temple. Rabbis would all have students, and those students would mostly be seeking to become rabbis themselves. And so rabbis would walk around, or they would plant themselves somewhere in the porch of the temple, and they would sit with 10 or 15 of their students, and they would just do Bible study. It would be kind of like this: pick a passage, talk about an idea, and that would be class for the day. Jesus, going up to the temple to teach, was essentially kind of modeling what rabbis would do. But immediately their criticism is pretty right on, because usually rabbis, think of professors in colleges. People don't become professors in colleges of any repute unless they've kind of earned their way. They start off as grad students, they are TAs, they have to get stuff published, they have to be an assistant, to be an associate, to then be a professor. So by the time they're a professor, they've really proven themselves, they've earned it in a sense, and people know who they are. In any particular discipline, you sort of know who the others are who are coming up within that discipline. Same kind of idea here with the temple. The rabbis who teach in the temple are known, and they've been known for years. They were excellent students. They became kind of junior teachers, and those junior teachers began to gather students to then become full-on teachers. And here Jesus just walks in, having bypassed that entire system, and then attracted a lot of attention. And so when we see here, the Jews were astonished, and they were saying, how does he have such learning because he's never been taught? What they're really saying is, he did not come up through our system. He did not go through the right steps to be a rabbi teaching in the temple. And so Jesus then says, anyone who actually knows God will know when God sends a teacher. Ooh. This is sharp. This is Jesus basically saying, you've created a system where you validate the teachers based on the teachers doing worldly things. You've forgotten that these teachers are teaching on God's behalf. If you actually focused on God, then you would know who was teaching the godly stuff. And so Jesus continues to thumb his nose at the establishment, those religious leaders who are highly invested in the status quo and begin to get mad at what Jesus is doing because Jesus is over and over again undermining the authority that they really love to have. Okay. When we get to this section, the crowds begin to criticize Jesus in a very particular way. And there are really two criticisms thrown at Jesus. The first is really about Jesus being a false teacher. That might seem relatively mundane to us, but in their system, as far back as Deuteronomy, so this is, wilderness time, all the way through the kingdom period, all the way through the exile, all the way now to the Second Temple period, the idea of false prophets has been kind of in the water of Jewish thought. And the penalty for being a false prophet or a false teacher is death. And so as the people begin to criticize Jesus for being a false teacher, we see that in verse 12. We kind of see the two options here. Some were saying he's a good man, while some say he's deceiving the crowd. That's essentially what the people are doing right now, is they're trying to figure out, is he good or is he bad? And being bad does not mean not a good teacher. Being bad means false teacher, false prophet. If he's deemed bad, that means he can be killed because he is working against the Jewish establishment. So it might sound like a small thing, but just like we saw in chapter 6, as people begin to diverge from Jesus, now we're seeing the formality of what will ultimately be the charges against Jesus in his trial begin to take shape. At the end of chapter 7, what I'm not going to even read today, we have this experience where the police are kind of sent to arrest Jesus, but then they don't. And the leaders say, why didn't you? And their answer essentially is, the people still like him. So part of what John is setting up is there's a slowing imbalance in whether Jesus is liked or not liked. At first, he's liked by the people. And so even though the religious leaders don't like him, they don't quite have the political will to get rid of him. But as Jesus begins to challenge the people more and more and more, that pendulum shifts. And once most people don't like what Jesus is doing, then the religious leaders have the political will to actually arrest and put him on trial and then execute him. And we see that wrestling right here in chapter 7 as people are trying to figure out, is he good or is he bad? Let's see. Jesus says a few times that his time has not yet come. This idea is critical in the Gospel of John because Jesus understands that his ministry is meant to connect to a certain time to create some deep theological meaning. Right now, we are at the Festival of Booths. The Festival of Booths is this agricultural festival. It's thanking God, in a sense, for rain and taking care of them and that sort of stuff. Jesus' identity is much more rooted in the idea of the Lamb. I mean, we know this from prophecies. We know in Revelation the idea of Jesus being the Lamb that is sacrificed on our behalf. And so Jesus' time, although it could simply be understood as Jesus just needs to do more stuff before his time comes, the theological understanding that John is really putting forward here is that Jesus' time comes in connection to Passover. Jesus' time does not connect to this particular religious festival of booths because the identity of those feast days has to do with how the followers of Jesus, the Christians in the first century and beyond, begin to understand Jesus. Whether this happened in real time or not is probably the less important question to ask. What we are seeing here is John tell the story of Jesus in a very specific way so that Jesus' identity is related to the Passover story and then made new. So we, of course, understand that Passover, that moment when the Israelites are saved from slavery in Egypt, they are freed, they are given new life to become God's people. Jesus now represents a macrocosmic kind of Passover, not just the physical, they were not killed in Egypt and they were let out of the physical place of Egypt, but that now all people, Jews plus everyone else, are actually being freed from the slavery of our human existence. And so Jesus's theological understanding, the Christology that we discussed at the beginning of John this year, is developed very much based on the idea of a Passover that now is not just for the Jewish people, but a Passover that is for everyone in the world in the cosmic sense. I can say a little bit more about that if you want me to, but does that make basic sense? Yeah? Follow-up question?
Well,
Mm-hmm.
there was, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, actually a difference of opinion, theological opinion during the first and second centuries as to whether Christianity was for Jews only or for others.
Yes, so the question about whether Jesus' identity, Jesus' saving presence, the Messiah in a sense, were just for Jews or was for everyone.
Yes.
Absolutely. So what we see in Acts of the Apostles is a real wrestling of whether or not the Messiah is really just for Jews or if the Messiah is for everyone. The Acts of the Apostles tries to answer that question very clearly by its structure. The first half of Acts is all about Peter and Jerusalem, and the second half of Acts is about Paul and Rome. Essentially, what the story is trying to create is the development of thought that, of course, the Messiah is understood within a Jewish context, but the Messiah is not limited to only Jewish people. And we see that in multiple explicit examples, one definitely being when Peter goes to the Romans' house, Cornelius' house, and he sees everybody receive the Spirit at once. All of a sudden, Peter, who had been someone who had probably been leaning on the whole Jesus is for Jewish people kind of side of that argument, sees God do something completely inclusive for the Gentiles. And Peter says, well, if God's doing that, then I've got to get on the train. And so they begin to shift away from Jerusalem and away from the Jewish people only. And then, of course, Paul goes about planting churches by starting in Jewish synagogues all over the Roman Empire, but relatively quickly, a year or two into Paul's ministry, the Jewish people understand that Paul shows up to synagogues, begins to teach, and then teaches about Jesus being the Messiah and throws the synagogues into uproar. And so then Paul isn't even welcome in the synagogues in the later part of his ministry. So he has to go to the Gentiles. That shift was hard because there were so many of the earliest followers of Jesus were really good Jewish people. When you look at the 12 apostles and most of the people who are following him during his life, they're all Jews because Jesus is fulfilling a Jewish prophecy. But as they begin to tell the story of Jesus, they realize God is not limiting Jesus only to Jewish people. That God means for the Israelites, for the Jewish people to be the tool that brings the entire world into complete relationship with God. That's the idea of chosenness that we've touched on multiple times. The Israelites, with no malice at all, how am I going to say this? Okay, so what I'm about to say can easily be misconstrued as judgy, so just roll with me for a minute. As Christians, the tradition that we have inherited essentially says that God chose the Israelites, who then became Jewish, to be the people that brought the world into God's saving presence, but with no intention, no malice, nothing like that. The Jewish people misunderstood chosenness as being better than, rather than having responsibility. That's all ancient Jewish identity. I think any Jewish people that you know today have a very mature, complex understanding of the way that Judaism works for them. But 2,000 years ago, essentially what Jesus' earliest followers began to discern is that God wanted the Israelites, the Jewish people, to bring everybody else under the umbrella of God. But instead, they kind of held what God had given them and didn't share. And so what Jesus as the Messiah does is corrects the misunderstanding that chosenness actually means responsible, and that the responsibility is to go out and bring everyone in, that everybody gets to be in. And that's really the shift that begins to include Gentiles and not limited to just the Jewish people. There you go. Any other questions? Okay, before we leave this first section of chapter 7, I want to talk about the way that Jesus speaks of the world. Jesus speaks of the world in a very particular way where he means those who have religious authority in his region. So those would be the priests, particularly the high priest, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all the people that we're familiar with in the gospel story. When I speak of the world in Bible study, I am, in a sense, speaking of the same thing, those who have authority and power. But when Jesus speaks of the world, he's really talking about people. When I speak of the world and the way in which the world can influence us to do things that move us away from God rather than toward God, I also mean systems of authority and power. That's a much harder idea for us to accept, because it's very easy for us to point toward a person, an individual, and say, that person is not helping me be the kind of person God made me to be. When we speak of systems that are kind of disembodied, that create environments that we really like, and that those systems are actually keeping us from growing as close as we can to being the people God made us to be, it's a whole lot harder. As we go through the rest of John, it's important for us, with kind of a level of grace and vulnerability, courage even, to begin wrestling with the way the world around us, not just people, but systems and environments, even culture, can actually keep us from growing in our own discipleship. To put this a different way, there are ways in which we understand what it means to be Christian that actually don't have anything to do with Jesus or with the Bible. We believe those ways of being Christian are true because we've inherited those understandings in our culture, whether that's our family, or it's our country, or it's our neighborhood, or it's our habits, or whatever that is. It's important for us to try to place ourselves outside of those systems as best we can, which we can never do 100%, but to try and be self-critical enough to know that there are ways in which we live that actually keep us, in a sense, shackled to a life that holds us back from being the kind of people God wants us to be. An easy thing would be the sense of lack that people tend to have about not having enough. I mean, I think it's pretty much to a person. People say that they believe that they don't have enough. And there really is nobody here in this room that doesn't have enough. We might feel like we don't have enough. We might feel like there's some sort of insecurity, but in truth, if we think about just the Festival of Tabernacles, going out and living outside, God will provide. God will provide. It doesn't mean we can act like idiots. That's not the point. It does, however, mean that the concern and the worry we have of not having enough is almost certainly based on a cultural understanding of what enough actually is. And in the world, in humanity, we all have plenty. We have way more than enough. And in fact, we have been so numbed by what we think we're supposed to have that even having all we do, we begin to think and worry about not having enough of what we need. And that's what I mean by kind of systems of power and authority and control that can actually draw us away from God. God wants us to feel comfortable and confident and courageous and understand that our gifts are meant to be shared. But the world has convinced us that we often don't have enough to share as much as we could. And it's just not true. And don't struggle or feel guilty if that doesn't quite make sense to you right now. I just want you to consider, especially as we go through Advent and into Christmas, just how much we actually do have, and to be grateful for that. Because when we shift from feeling like we don't have enough to being grateful for all that we have, all of a sudden, it's as if we're just filled with giftedness, and we can be generous over and over and over, and the generosity will really not stop because we've shifted our mindset to understand just how much we actually do have. Okay, that's enough for that. Okay, before we get into the next section, any questions or comments? All right, let's talk about the identity of the Messiah. Jesus continues his debate. So we know Jesus didn't really want to go to the festival. Then he showed up to the festival in incognito. And then after a few days, he shows up and he starts teaching in the temple. Now everybody sees him, and there are certain people who want to kill him. And so the crowd begins to criticize him, particularly the religious leaders. And Jesus begins a debate around his messianic identity. So let's look at verse 25. Now some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, "Is not this the man whom they are trying to kill? And here he is, speaking openly. But they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Messiah? Yet we know where this man is from, but when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from." Then Jesus cried out as he was teaching in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I am from. I have not come on my own, but the one who sent me is true, and you do not know him. I know him, because I am from him, and he sent me." Then they tried to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. Yet many in the crowd believed in him and were saying, "When the Messiah comes, will he do more signs than this man has done?" So, as I noted earlier, there's a bit of an irony here where they really want to arrest him, but the people aren't going to arrest him because they know that if they try to arrest Jesus, who is quite popular right now with the crowds would essentially rebel against the religious leaders. So their power and their authority is tenuous. It's based on, I heard someone say this the other day about elected officials. Elected officials have moon power, not sun power. Have you heard this? I love this image because the power comes from the people. The people have the actual power source. But those in authority, religious leaders or political leaders, whatever, they have only what is reflected on them from the people, like the moon. And I thought it was great. I love that. So these religious leaders, they really only have moon power. They don't have sun power. And so at this point, the people still have all the power. And even though the religious leaders want to arrest Jesus, they want to kill Jesus, they know they don't have the authority or the mandate, so to speak, of the people to actually accomplish that just yet. Now, as Jesus continues to teach, the people in the crowd are asking the obvious question: is he the Messiah? They've been waiting for this Messiah, and they're wondering if Jesus is the one. And this debate will continue way beyond, and we're going to see that there's a lot of imagery here about David, because the prophecy says the Messiah will come from the line of David. Now, for those of us who are reading this closely, we see the people say, hey, we know where he's from. And Jesus says, yeah, you know where I'm from. And we might think to ourselves, they think he's from Nazareth. They think he's from Galilee. Later on, they're going to say things like, but the Messiah is going to come from the line of David, not from Galilee. And we might be thinking super cleverly, well, actually, he was born in Bethlehem. Ha ha ha. Jesus does not even take that line of argument. Jesus goes completely separately from the physicality of the messianic identity. We're thinking, along with the crowd, that Jesus has to prove his blood relation to David, the physicality of where he comes from. Now, technically speaking, that's fine, because we know Jesus is from the line of David. We know Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We understand that Jesus has checked all of those physical, worldly, tangible boxes in order to qualify to be the prophesied Messiah. But for Jesus, that's not even really the point. Sure, he checks those boxes if you need him to check those boxes. But what Jesus is really saying is, if you actually knew God, then you would understand that I am from God. And that being from God, I can bring you to God. So rather than debating the people or the leaders on the merit of their particular argument, Jesus kind of flips it around. And Jesus says that if the people knew what was right, they would understand that Jesus was representing what was completely right and true. So, in a sense, or to put another way, what Jesus is really doing here in this moment with the people is he's beginning to explain how through him we can see the truth of God, that he is like a window, and we see through that window into a truth that the world has essentially clouded. Because we are human, because we are self-interested, because we like to be comfortable and secure, we like stuff, we like authority, we will naturally mess up God's message. But in the person of Jesus, we see most clearly who God is and who God wants us to be. It's like what I have said multiple times in here: when people out in the world, or us, or our friends, or our family members, challenge us about how being Christian is supposed to look, but they use some idea in the Bible that is not of Jesus in order to defend the kind of Christianity they think is right, it's incumbent upon us to know actually what Jesus taught and who Jesus is, so that we begin first with Jesus. If we don't start with Jesus, we're messed up. If we go back to some random idea from the Old Testament, which is fine, or even worse, some idea from Paul and his letters, Paul's trying. I mean, he's doing his best, but Paul's still human. If we go with Paul or with a prophet or with someone else and we don't go with Jesus, we are making the mistake. And there are lots of people around us who don't even understand that simple idea, because all they're doing is espousing an idea or a way of being or a way of defining the world that they don't even realize comes from somewhere else and not Jesus. And so part of what we get to do here in a gospel Bible study is to figure out what is of Jesus and what is not. What is not can still be biblical. But if it's not Jesus, and it conflicts with who we see Jesus to be, We got to start with Jesus, or else we're actually not literally Christian. And that's a great debate for your Christmas dinner table. Any question about that idea? Yes.
The Jews clearly assumed they were the chosen people, in the sense of being not responsible, but chosen by God to be the ones that represented them. And then after the first century, especially when Constantine took it over and everything, the Christians became, in essence, the chosen people, not in the sense of representing, but in being chosen by God to be God's people. How did that work?
Okay, so the question is, in history in the first, say, four-ish hundred years, you had Judaism, and out of Judaism came the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who then fulfilled the messianic prophecy to become the Christ, but for the world, not just for the Jewish people. And so for a period of time, there was this kind of radical inclusion of everybody until the problem of Constantine, which is Constantine, as emperor of Rome, realized, if you can't beat them, join them. And so he assumed Christianity as legal in the empire, and then it was as if they kind of put on the costume of Christian in order to then use the will of all the Christian people to actually benefit the political and economic machine of Rome. And in a sense, maybe in the great irony, the Roman Christians made a very similar mistake about chosenness that the Jewish people had made before Jesus. Is that right? So, it is a great observation, and it is very generous to understand that kind of evolution, because what we're really talking about is the problem of being human. The problem of being human is that we always think we're right. Always. And so you can look at any group of people at any point in history, and it's rare that a group says that they have the power of the economy, of the military, of the politic, and they say, actually, we're really wrong. When does that happen? Never. Because it's the problem of humanity. And so what's important for us is to not shame any one group of people. It's super easy for Christians, and we've done it over and over again, to fall very quickly into anti-Semitism because we somehow say the Jews didn't understand and we get it all. That is lazy and it's untrue. It's important for us to be able to wrestle with the literal, tangible, historical context of things like a gospel story that actually does have Judaism as one of the foils through which we can understand Jesus, but please do not stop there, because we need to very quickly then criticize most of Christianity through most of Christian history for doing exactly the same thing, because we are human people, and our humanity is actually what creates the problem. Hey, what does that sound like? Oh, that sounds like sin. Yes, look at that. I mean, the entire theology of Christianity is based on how we are inherently messed up. Jesus is here to help us do what we cannot do. We cannot do this. If all Jesus is for you is a philosopher or a teacher or a clever t-shirt quote, then you've missed the point. Jesus is Savior. Saving us from what? From ourselves. Because we can't do what God made us to do on our own. Jesus actually makes possible our fulfillment of being created in God's image. Only people who understand their powerlessness understands Christianity. And so typically, especially in wealthy, authoritative nations like America, people can go for a very long time and Christianity never actually makes sense because their lives are secure, they are healthy, they never really lose anything of material, and on and on. It's really only when we experience crisis and we understand that there is a limit to what we can do as human people does the promise of Jesus actually begin to make sense. Our job, if we have figured that out, is to lovingly bring those who have not figured that out yet into community with us so that when life hits them square in the face and they finally know they cannot do it on their own, we're there to help show them who can save them. That's the church. That's the best of a church. And so for us as 21st century Christians, I actually think we've got an opportunity that looks a lot more like first century Christians than we have in a very long time. I think if we look back at 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, Christianity was always just the cultural power. In the 21st century, Christianity is no longer the cultural power. Now, we can kind of ignore that in North Dallas if we want to, because we still live in a community where church is still sort of important. I mean, at least people show up probably to get their kids baptized, maybe to get their kids confirmed. That's about it. Otherwise, it's Christmas, I guess we'll go to church, reluctantly, but at least we'll show up. It's that kind of thing. Christianity is no longer like the power in our culture. And so in a sense, we have an opportunity in that weakness to realize what is actually powerful about the gospel. And if we can get that right, then all of a sudden, people can be legitimately Christian, not culturally Christian, but actually Christianity becomes much more our core identity than just part of the way that we live in the world because we're simply American. That's never been good enough. But we spent a couple hundred years acting like it. Now we can't act like it anymore. And so part of what we get to do is actually get more committed in a way that is more transformative, the way God, I think, wanted it to be, because it's no longer easy. And through that struggle, it can actually become more real to us. And then it can become more real to others too. But we've got to get them in. That's the hard part for us, is that we were all raised essentially in a culture that didn't require us to be terribly evangelical because everybody just showed up. The old joke about, Episcopal evangelism is painting the front doors red and waiting for the right people to show up. That is no longer good enough. We actually have to figure out why this matters to us in our weakness, so that then we can go out and tell that story to others, so that when they experience their weakness, they feel God's presence in a very real way. Okay, I've got 90 seconds. So hold on, we're going to finish chapter 7. As the ceremony progresses of the Festival of Booths, the very last of the festival is this ceremonial kind of water jubilation where the priests will pour water and wine over the altar and they celebrate the rains that fill and all the other stuff. At the very end, Jesus speaks of the living water that he provides. And he is really doing something that has double meaning here. In the tangible sense of this area of the world that is very arid, water is actually literally life. And living water for them in Israel meant running water. Occasionally rain would fall, and the rain would not be absorbed into the earth, and you would get these flash floods. And if they could control the flash floods and collect the rain in cisterns, they could then survive the dry periods. So Jesus is using that idea of living running water to then raise everyone's awareness up to speak of what actual living water provides. Think back to the woman at the well in Samaria, where Jesus says, you can keep drinking from this water, but then you're just going to be thirsty again. But if you drink of the water I provide, you will never be thirsty. This is, in a sense, what Jesus is trying to teach right here at the end of the festival. Look at what the priests are doing, pouring water over the altar. You're thanking God for the literal water that falls to the earth. But what I am trying to get you to be aware of and to accept and to celebrate and glorify is water that will not leave you thirsty ever again, but will deeply satisfy and fulfill you, complete you, because God has transformed you beyond our human limitations into the fullness of God's created image. And so we'll stop there. We'll kind of clean that up next week, and then we'll keep going with chapter 8. Thank you all very much. I'll see you next week.